Welcome to the third session in the Write Your Magnificent Book webinar series. You know, when I was designing this program, I decided that I definitely wanted to address in that first session busting the talent myth, overcoming writer's block, and powerful writing tips and strategies. I also knew from discussions with people that it would be important to have a session on structure, structuring your book, structuring your time, etc. And I knew that people wanted to understand publishing options. What was the path lying ahead if they self-published? What was the path if they sought a publisher, etc., which is what's coming up next week. So that left a fourth week, and I knew that I wanted to deal with language, look at language, because as a writing teacher and writing coach of many years now, I was observing in the writing that people were bringing to me that there's kind of a erosion of skill, you might say. There's quite a lot of people who just do not seem to be aware of all sorts of rules around writing. And also noticing that bad language is kind of taking a hold of society. I guess with the texting and the abbreviated everything, the instant everything, our fast food society. We've got workshops around writing a book in a weekend, all that kind of stuff. I wanted to bring back some of the art of writing because I have looked at books that people have asked me to endorse when they've been through some of those write your bestseller book, very fast kind of programs. And the writing quality really left quite a lot to be desired. So something I have wanted to do is to put a bit of a line in the sand around not coming across as an amateur, having your writing really strong, returning to the art of writing and really respecting and honouring the art of writing rather than just producing something fast because we can talk and so therefore everyone can write a book. I don't think it's that simple. So I'm going to unpack some of those ideas and teach some of those, some of that lost knowledge perhaps. Some of it's going to sound a bit like school again, but hopefully it will be more meaningful this time now that you're actually writing your magnificent book. So enjoy this session. Welcome to Write Your Magnificent Book, Tips and Techniques for Aspiring Authors, session number 3, which is all about language. So let's just do a quick recap of the last homework exercises. First one was to ask yourself which approach, regular commitment, blitz or unstructured, resonates with you and why. So consider when you're answering this, what might get in the way of writing, how are you going to deal with those potential challenges, and how can we support you? The second exercise was which approach, plotting, pantsing, or a balance resonates with you and why? And in answering that one, think about how do you usually write? What are you drawn to for this particular book? Why? The third exercise was to explore your target market. So age, gender, occupation, why those people. The fourth one was to mind map a quick outline of your book. Find yourself a working title and a subtitle, put that in the centre of the page, then have 5 to 10 branches going out from that centre that could be your chapters and aim for 3 to 5 points per branch or sub-branches per main branch. So if you do get the 10 branches, your 10 chapters and your 3 to 5 main points per chapter. That gives you a starting point structure. Remember to consider your audience as you're doing this. Are they experts, lay persons, youth or mixed? Exercise number 5 was to use Bernice McCarthy's method and format your book. So that is to ask or to answer these 4 questions in this order. Why should your market read the book? What are your main points? What's the information, the facts? How do readers apply the principles? And what are some other applications they could consider? The 6th exercise was to think of a point you would like to make in your book and then apply Dale Carnegie's story point benefit format to how you tell it. So think first what is the point you're wanting to make and then what story will illustrate that point and what is the benefit to your market of applying this principle or behaviour. And then stitch those elements together in the story point benefit sequence. Exercise 7, not short on exercises, are we? Is if this structure appeals to you, map out your book in the steps of the hero's journey. So this is to consider, first of all, what is your hero's starting point or ordinary world? What challenge or opportunity is presented to your hero? What is the growth that is required? That's the same question, basically. And then who are the hero's mentors, allies, and enemies? How does she or he deal with these challenges? And what is the outcome of that journey? Now, remember that this is a structure that can work for fiction, for making up a story, but it can also work for your own true story if you look at it through that lens, through those questions, and it can also work for many book outlines if you have a bit of thought about it. Feel free to post any questions in the Facebook group if you'd like more clarity on that. The 8th exercise was, if appropriate again, work on your title, pitch, or blurb and cover or poster. So this is from that movie screenplay writing model, and that is having a killer title, having a pitch, so if someone said, what's it about, that you can answer in 1 or 2 compelling sentences, and having a movie poster image that can crystallise your view of it, or the cover of your book, already having those things. And the blurb of your book is something you might write up front too. It's a little bit like that pitch. The last exercise from last week was, if appropriate, work on synopses of your book and each of the chapters of your book, plus that character checklist if you're working at a fictional level or if that is relevant at some level. Okay, that was a fair bit. I hope they've been useful to you, or they are useful to you when you've done them. So here's a question to explore before we leap into our session on language. And the question is, why do we write? And there are lots of answers. To get a job or win a tender, to tell someone we love them, to communicate our story and values, like in the form of a memoir to children or a blog to peers, to change the world or some part of it as a social act, to teach something, to achieve a result, to tell a story, to find out what we want to say, to clarify our thoughts. I find that one very relevant for me, especially when I'm writing fiction. It reminds us why we live. It's a proof of civilization. Our civility depends upon language and expression and communication. To witness something, whether beautiful or ugly, to be the scribe for those living ordinary yet important lives. To heal ourselves, and in the process, our writing may heal or save others, or cause someone to change their mind on something, or start a worthwhile rumour. As a way of playing the instrument we've been given, to create beautiful music, the art of the language itself, to draw out the knowledge within the reader. Educare is a Latin word meaning to draw out the wisdom within. So as compared to a model of education where a student is seen as an empty vessel that we're aiming to fill up, the Educare model is saying that the student already is very wise. We're aiming to remind them of what they already know, to bring it to their conscious awareness, bring the wisdom out. And that's the level at which we recognise something as being wise when we hear it. And to keep the language itself alive. So an exercise for another time is a free writing exercise for you to ask yourself why you write. Not why you're writing this specific book, because we've done that exercise, I hope, but more why you write at all. What is your answer to that question? You might also like to write about something you care very deeply about. You might like to write about what you know and what you don't know, like explore the line between what you know and what you don't know. Something interesting to me is the idea that it's not always our expertise that counts, but the quality of our wondering about it. When I wrote the Mastery Club, I've had quite a process, a journey to go on since writing it around, do I have to be living as a complete master in my life because I wrote a book about mastery? And I have to keep reminding myself, well, no, that's not the point. The point is that I'm asking questions that assist others and, of course, myself in thinking about what mastery is. So another exercise is to ask yourself who your writing serves. And I know you've looked at this from the point of view of your target market, but sometimes when we just phrase a question a different way, that different word serves can flush out a slightly different answer. So you might like to have a look at this. Because after all, There could be many potential readers of your work, so it could be a good exercise to mind map or cluster all those potential readers. And we are, after all, writing for a reader. Let's flip to the other side of the question, why do we read? C.S. Lewis says to know we are not alone, to find out how others live and how we live ourselves, to connect with others, to feel safe, to console ourselves, to escape a troubling world, to seek refuge somewhere else, to grow and deepen our knowledge and awareness and sensitivity. After all, the writer creates an imaginary space and the reader participates in the unfolding of the story. Together they co-create the story. And wisdom arises in the reader if the writing is done well. So again, for another time, you might like to ask yourself why you read and write about that. So now here comes a very important question. Why write well? We talked about this in the very first session, or at least what we did was we asked what is good writing, and we discovered that good writing is many things. But let's just take a step back first and ask why write well? First answer, because good writing provides a bridge for the communication of our ideas. A sentence that is structurally unsound will fail as surely as a physical bridge that is structurally unsound. Neither will be much good for carrying the traffic it's made for, people in one case and meaning in the other. Quote by Mark Trednick, the author of the Little Red Writing Book. You'll find I've quoted him a lot through this. I've just finished reading that book and I just thought it was wonderful. So in the first webinar, we looked at one of my tests for good writing, which is that it's like a clear glass window, that we're not stopped by poor expression or grammar or punctuation. And so because the language itself is flawless, we are just effortlessly in the world of the story. And so that's what this point is about, that we communicate our ideas better when our expression is really sound, is really strong and clear. Second reason, because good writing is in itself beautiful. What makes writing worth writing and reading is what the story or poem achieves beyond the tale it tells. Its music, its wisdom, its form, the way it makes the ordinary world beautifully strange. A good tale is only good, in other words, if the telling is sound and memorable. Yelled Mark Trednick again. And of course that's Shakespeare, the bard, as they call him. Third reason, because we are representing others or we aim to inspire an action of some sort. We might be writing on behalf of a local action group, a tender for our company, a report for our department, a book about our family. If you act on behalf of others, they depend on you to give them your best, so take care of them. Fourth reason, for democracy and out of sheer respect for our fellow humans. I'm not the first person to notice that we have entered deeply into an era of bad language. I fear we will live for a long time with the consequences of this bad language if we don't do something about it now. Democracy, not just art, depends on the lucid expression of careful and independent thinking. I'm writing the Little Red Writing Book because I'd like to encourage richer and smarter writing. So here's a story for you about my first ever corporate training. I received a letter from our insurance company, and the letter was so badly written, it was so full of jargon and stiff formality that I called the company and said, I believe you need my services to make your writing more user-friendly. Now it so happened, this is back in the 80s, and it so happened that they were about to revisit all of their literature. And so they invited me in, and I'd never ever before led a corporate training at that point in time. So I put on my power clothes, went in and acted as if I knew what I was talking about and sold them on a corporate training. And then I went back and ran a couple of corporate trainings before I ended up being pregnant and having to step out of that. And I'll never forget one particular moment where I was presenting this material to some managers. And one of the managers was saying, but these clients, they should understand their policies. They should understand this jargon, this language. It's their policy. And I looked him in the eye and said, but they won't. And he said, but they should. And I leaned toward him across the table and I said, but they won't. And he kept saying, but they should. And I kept saying, but they won't. And what I was wanting to give him was a reality check. The people don't live by should. They are, you know. And People are not going to go to the effort of trying to understand all this stuff, and it's actually not their responsibility to do that, and I hope I'm going to make that very clear by the end of this session, this webinar session, because really it's our job when we're providing a service to make it easy and user-friendly and accommodating. So let's just step sideways and ask, what is influencing us in our writing? So we use language daily, but what is influencing us in how we use language? Because many of us have been operating on writing lessons from school that we learnt a long time ago, or old traditions that are out of keeping with modern forms of expression. And sometimes we have childhood misunderstandings that have persisted. For example, someone I know who said, "I would have given it to you," instead of "I would have given it to you," probably because she heard "I would have," would apostrophe VE, as a child, and thought she was hearing "would of" when she was actually hearing a contracted form of "would have." So let's ask now, what is good writing? What is bad writing? How write well? What do you think? We looked at this, as I said in the very first session. Writing is like a clear glass window. It creates a world, it leaves an impact. But what else? What do you think? So here's a couple of answers that some participants have shared. Good writing, it's clear, concise, correct, conversational, effective, inspiring, thought-provoking, alive. Bad writing is unclear, waffly, stiff, boring, a strain to read, confusing. Good writing it comes from the verb thrifty, which means economical, and thrifty comes from the verb to thrive. So isn't that interesting that language that's concise and succinct is actually the healthiest, the richest? As for bad writing, we want to avoid the sort of writing where a bad word is like a thorn among roses, when that thorn really sticks out, as Emmy said in this webinar. And we want to avoid the sort of bad writing where we are wading through stuff, we're bored, we're already in information overload, as Melissa said, and we want to be able to get to the point quickly. Okay, so good writing. Winston Churchill said, "Short words are best, and the old words, when they are short, are the best of all." And that's very nice. So good writing is clear, it's short, it's alive. English loves short, grounded words best. It works most poetically, powerfully, and clearly when it uses words like these: earth, man, woman, child, now, here, world, drink, eat, time, shop, dark, light, fail, grief, joy, stone, timber, work, smile, tree. English is rich and includes an abundance of words from other nations and from a variety of disciplines, but it does its best work when we write sentences made of short, familiar words put together in a variety of interesting ways. Good writing sounds like the best sort of talking, Mark Trednick says. Clear, careful, animated and memorable. When you write, you talk on paper. When it's good, you sing. As for bad writing, here's an example. If one concedes with Levinas and Blanchot that Heidegger's version of this twist of language upon itself, Dichtung, does not eschew vestiges of phenomenology, namely in Heidegger, the transcendental element of language is still being determined, however subtly, by way of certain phenomena in the world, then Heideggerian aletheia and disclosure must be reconceptualised as a mobility or dislocation of in language, and this syntactical twisting is alone the peculiar non-essence of language as a form of non-phenomenal spacing. Timothy Clark is clearly very educated. You might have noticed me tripping as I was reading this, and that's often what happens when, apologies Timothy, when the writing is not good. So, the more the long words and the more complex, the more difficult it is to read, to aloud, to read silently, to ourselves, and to comprehend. A man who makes use of a host of long words is like a man who stirs up the mud in a pool in which, he tells you, he has dropped a pearl of great price. Walter Murdoch said this. He's an essayist. So he says, look warily at any word in your work that ends in ism, ology, or ality, or in fact I think it was Mark Trednick who says that, as in environmentality, or words that end in tion or ment. Ask yourself if there's not another way to say it. Interrogate similarly every word of longer than 3 syllables. When we wish to hide our thoughts or the fact that we have not thought at all, we use long words, and there he is again, in defence of plain thought and speech. So he reckons the man who uses too many long words doesn't know what they mean or doesn't want you to know. Long words are either a sign of muddled thinking or of sham erudition. So this is not about dumbing people down or dumbing our writing down. Writing in short words is not dumbing down. It is in fact smartening up. Until you can say even the most complex thing in simple words, you probably haven't thought it through or don't understand it properly yourself. So here's an example of that. Bob Proctor, who is a leader in the area of the power of the mind, talks about the word psycho-cybernetics. There's a book called Psycho-Cybernetics by Maxwell Maltz, and he had read this book multiple times and taught about it multiple times. One day a student came up to him and said, what exactly does psycho-cybernetics mean? And Bob said, well, what it means is, and realised he didn't know. He couldn't put it in clearly into words. He couldn't define it easily himself. And so until we can express something in simple language ourselves, we actually don't really understand it. Never compromise the complexity of the concepts you need to relate, but find words for them that are not themselves complex, abstract, or recondite, right? Because we think and write most clearly in short, plain, concrete terms. So here is a list of words and phrases for us to replace in our language. Rest assured, prior to, further to, with regard to or regarding, find attached, herewith, as discussed, effective immediately, as to, so as to. Take a moment to have a go at an exercise converting these that you'll find in the workbook I've attached, because that's very antiquated language. So I'd like you to convert the abstract words and phrases into everyday language, or make your own list of falsely profound language from your own literature and convert, or that you've observed in the world, and convert it into everyday language. Good writing. I should have said pause the slideshow so that you can do that. All right, here we go again. The more you write as though you were saying something to someone, the better they are likely to understand, be moved, be changed, be sold. The more they are likely to read on and still be awake at the end. But it's not just talk, everyday language type of thing. Writing that works is talking tidied up. Effort has been applied. For example, I know someone who wrote a book by dictating into a machine, right? And then transcribing. But what happens when we just talk like that is we bring errors of expression with us. So there was a lot of waffle in the way he had his draft of his book emerged, and there was a lot of editing to do to tighten it up. So good writing is speaking compressed, clarified, enriched and heightened by thought and art and set down on paper. It's the most exact form of thinking. So it's not just rambling, waffling, just talking. While good writing is talking, it's talking tidied up. So why do we write badly? Writers, especially in business, political, academic and professional settings, steer clear of such simplicity and humanity in writing, if I may be generous for a moment, because they are trying to be dispassionate and objective. These are worthy aspirations as far as they go, but if they lead to writing stripped of its humanity, they have failed a more important test of communication. Be objective, but not like this. So we have here George Bernard Shaw, and he says, language is the chief means by which the professions conspire against the public. Mark Trednick says, Knowledge is power, and difficult, imperious language is the best way to hold on to knowledge and power. Language becomes the secret tool of a profession, a way of not making things clear, a tool for clever obfuscation, a way of hedging bets and keeping one's nose clean. We all know that when language is being used for politics, it's hard to understand if you're uninitiated. It's dense and vague, it's abstract and impersonal, it's formal and cold or falsely breezy, it's heavy on ideology and light on fact. It's loud about ends but quiet about means, it's polysyllabic, it dwells on processes, not people. It's passive. These are all fine ways to say nothing much at all while taking a long time to say it. Writing like this intends not to include, but to exclude its readers. It means to deter them, not to invite them in. Such writing is caution and self-interest run amok. Its roots go down to fear and, deeper still in some cases, to an instinct for keeping hold of one's secrets. I actually think the fear is the bottom. I mean, why do we keep secrets? Because of some fear. But basically here, what he's saying, good writing needs to transcend politics. It needs to rise above fear. It needs to speak plainly to its readers, aiming to say as much as possible, as economically as possible. And it must be everything that fearful political writing is not. It must be humane, plain, active, informal, concrete, clear and specific. It must have a voice, a life. There's a risk of losing your subject matter, of losing your exact meaning as the abstraction of your subject matter increases. It is hard, of course, to write concretely when your subject matter is itself abstract. If you are a philosopher, say, or an IT professional, a policy writer or financier, if you want to write about products, ideas, structures, policies, economics, strategy, politics, and human relations. But that's the challenge, and there's no shirking it. So avoid abstract words like economy, policy, reform, administration, return on investment, financial management, demand, leadership, minimisation, style, because you cannot see, hear, touch, taste or smell them. They point to things that have no actual existence. They have no form. They are concepts, processes, systems. We understand them through the process of conceptual thinking. We need to talk about such things as love and economics, management and grief, law and order and quantum physics, and humans are good at processing concepts, but we can only understand them fully when we can translate them into an image of someone, somewhere, doing something in the real world. Avoid generalities as well. General words contain multitudes and allude to them all together. Furniture, stationery, assets, facilities, literature, landscape. Write instead in concrete and particular terms about even the most abstract and general topics. Most style manuals recommend speaking in this concrete and particular language, but that principle is broken by almost every corporate and government brochure, every financial pronouncement, every academic paper, every lawyer, every accountant. It is Strunk and White, they're experts on language and expression. It's their second rule of style. Avoid also nominalizations and compound nouns. Compound nouns are strings of nouns or noun clusters like end-of-year function, lottery ticket sales, or future after-tax cash flows, or home loan interest declaration. All those words are pretty much nouns, apart from that preposition, the prepositions of and after. They make bad reading. Use them sparingly, if at all. They are the language of the anxious or pompous, and they can be ambiguous. For example, an English history teacher, or enterprise resource planning system, or Little Penguin Safety Steering Committee, Oyster Cellular Heavy Metal Distribution, Demand Management Investigation Methodology. Goodness, they're awful, aren't they? Professional writing has trouble with verbs. It focuses on processes. It abstracts and it nominalizes things that people do, and then it leaves the people out. This results, among other things, in noun clusters, so watch out for them. They are horrible to behold and hard to unravel. We shouldn't require our reader to do the work. Right? So remember, nominalizations we discussed in the very first session about talent. They are disguised verbs. They exist in name only. And this sort of language where there are no verbs, which is characteristic of bureaucratic writing, and that is so abstract, strips language of activity and of actors. It's snobbish to think that those long words are where the richness or intelligence lie. So use the whole language, especially the short words. Listen for and use nouns and verbs. Concrete words point to things that have form and life in the actual world, things we can see or touch or hear or smell. A pen, a car, a woman, a man, a boy, a watch, a sparrow, a cottage, a log, a cheese sandwich. Readers need and respond to examples, stories, images, quantities, names, times, places. The mind and soul love the particular. Most of us struggle with abstraction outside our particular field and even within it. If you write abstractly, you ask your reader to translate what you are saying into the sensible world. And note that word sensible. Sensible means perceived by the senses. You know, I actually reckon that I did not persist with university studies because I just found that the language too difficult to deal with, that long, wordy, abstract, general kind of language. Take the trouble to make a difficult thing plain and your reader will feel more intelligent. So don't try to outsmart your reader. Two different but closely related rules of style, therefore, are make the abstract concrete and make the general particular. Use verbs. Verbs make sentences go. They are the life, pulse, heartbeat, action of a sentence. Nouns and verbs are the load-bearing walls of your writing. Verbs like these bring your writing to life. Crunch, burn, limp, blister, sting, cry, shout, dance, sweep, giggle, bleed, stagger, crawl, leap, wonder, touch, kiss, weep, sigh, laugh, eat, sleep, tease, poke, ride, write, help, flee. So the secret to bringing your sentences to life is to make sure you put people in, particularly in the role of performing the verb, the whos, and use strong, clear verbs, particularly the verb performed by the subject, it's the doing part of your sentence, and be very clear and concrete about what exactly is going on, the what. So not stuffy, pompous, but simple and clear. So you can ask yourself, what would this thing I'm trying to say actually look like if someone could see it happening? Which is pretty much what they will be trying to do. They'll be translating a sentence. How will they know if the thing I'm describing has occurred? What would that feel, look like? Who would then be doing what? How could this statement be observed and measured? Here's a good example. Bad language. The service operates within a harm minimisation approach with the objective of assisting clients to re-establish their independence and facilitate reunification with the community. Better. A bus goes out at night, picks up people on the city streets affected by drugs and alcohol, finds shelter for them, dries them out and tries to set them straight. You can see that that second example is just effortless to understand. It's simple, concrete language, whereas the first one is just up itself, if I can be so plain. All right, it's just too wordy. Okay. We have become used to bad language because we hear it so often. And it's dull, inhumane, and tuneless. After a while, we stop noticing that, because we're so used to it. And then we start to write that way ourselves. Good writing takes the time to honour details, to explore, to reflect, to plumb the depths of something. However, it also doesn't ramble. The best writing is tight. It conveys a lot in a few words. This appears to be a paradox. The bottom line is that every word must count. So keep your writing trim, use simple language, cut dead wood. Once you start using expressions like "it is noted that" and "we observed that," it is hard to stop. So here's an exercise. Tell a friend or imagine telling a friend something that you have to communicate. Give yourself 2 minutes to pass on that message. Then do the same message in 1 minute. Then convey the same message in 30 seconds and then in 15 seconds. It will help you to crystallise your thoughts. Another time is the next time you have to write, even if a scholarly piece, write it as if in an email to a friend. Then return to the actual document and write it in that tone of voice, the one to the friend, or as close to it as you can. Or write as if you're explaining the concept to a child. So these 3 exercises will help you take your language out of that really pompous, stuffy style. We want to be concise and precise. Use shorter words like rain and because instead of longer words like precipitation, and shorter phrases like apply instead of longer phrases like make an application and due to the fact that. Lose unnecessary adverbs, adjectives and prepositions. Good contemporary writing is rich in nouns and verbs and poor in adjectives and adverbs. Describe through action, senses, detail as tightly as you can. Avoid pleonasms such as forward planning, specific example, close proximity, close scrutiny, individual person, revert back, pre-book, free gift, component parts, consensus of opinion, future prospects. Hope you've figured out that a pleonasm is when you're basically saying the same thing twice, right? A free gift, clearly a gift is free, right? Drop that whenever, the word that this is, drop the word that whenever you can. Often people use the word that too many times. So have a go at this exercise. In your workbook, you've got an exercise called Tighten Your Text, which is about an exercise in being concise. So have a go at that one now. Pause the slideshow to do that. And then come back for more on avoiding jargon and resisting trends. So language like pushing the envelope, moving forward, segue, morph, 24/7, keep me in the loop, get across it, take a rain check, touching base, get across it. Oh, I got that twice. Oops. I think there was something else I was going to write in there. All right, well, those kinds of language are just trends, and we want to avoid the trends, and we want to avoid jargon. As you know, jargon is okay if you're speaking inside your industry to people who completely understand the jargon. Definitely not okay when you're speaking outside of the industry, or to clients, as in that insurance example I gave you, who might not hold that jargon at the forefront of their mind. You're better off explaining things in simple language. So have a go. There's an exercise in the workbook to identify the jargon used in your industry and find simple, authentic, everyday words you can use instead. The sort of language you would use when speaking to a child or an outsider. Also, along the same lines, refuse clichés. Say it your way. So clichés are expressions like the plague, great scheme of things, pressures of daily life, back in touch with nature, fresh perspective, ride roughshod over, build up a head of steam. Those last two are a bit archaic, and if you find yourself saying something that's archaic and you have no idea what it means, it's probably a cliche that's very out of date. Don't say it. Clichés were original once. Right? They were someone's brilliant idea for a unique way of expressing something that everyone just picked up and borrowed and copied. But the best writing is strong, unprecedented, and plain, and familiar language, right? So there's a big list of clichés in your workbook as an example. And if you're writing fiction, obviously it's okay in a character's speech if it's genuinely characteristic of them. But other than that, write everything from scratch rather than using conventional phrases. So be plain and authentic, be original. So there's an exercise for you to identify the clichés you or people around you in your industry use and find simple, authentic, everyday words you can use instead. We'll pause the slideshow now and have a go at that one. Avoid passive, be active. So these are two, these are called the passive voice and the active voice. The active voice is where the subject drives the action. For example, we propose changes. We is the subject. The passive is when the subject is acted upon, right? Often by an unnamed agent. For example, changes are proposed. We don't know who they're proposed by. The subject, the actor, the agent is missing. And the changes are being imposed upon us. So the active voice is clear and direct. The passive voice is formal and indirect. It is perceived to be calm, objective, formal. I said formal already. Gosh, I'm having double-itis through this slideshow. I have to fix that one. And more professional than the active voice, but the effect is often confusing and convoluted. So the problems with passive. Passive voice can sound officious, pompous, impersonal, detached, lofty, stiff. It strips sentences of humanity, personality and life. It makes readers uncomfortable and suspicious. It downplays agency by leaving out the actors or delaying their appearance. It implies that things have occurred at the hand of some god. The writer takes no responsibility and even couldn't care. For example, Richard Nixon with the Watergate situation. Mistakes have been made. The writer sounds like a bureaucrat or a cheat. Passive expression withholds information, which is somewhat passive-aggressive or defensive. We have to guess at the full meaning because it's vague. It's inefficient. It uses an excess of words, yet is often incomplete. And it's dull and boring to read because there's no clear action and no actors. Right? A license will be issued upon receipt. That's passive. The following are key components we noted during our investigation. That's passive. Active would be, we will issue a license to you upon receipt of your, or our study noted the following factors. It's just much easier to understand. When to use passive voice? There is a place for it. For variety and coherence of prose, as the connecting sentence on occasion. For example, in the middle of a paragraph where most of the sentences are active, you might have a passive line like, the group was formed in 1987. We hardly notice passive when it's an occasional statement woven into active prose. Diversity in language is good. Irrelevance of the actor. So, for example, the government has been re-elected, or the game was cancelled, maybe due to a snowstorm, but the snowstorm as the actor is not as relevant to the message that's been communicated at that point in time. Ignorance. When we don't know the actor, for example, the files have been deleted, we don't know by whom. A rumour has been started. Though active would work, we can say someone has started a rumour, someone has deleted the files. If for inactivity of the subject, for example, the rights of the people are protected. To not blame anyone or to take the heat off oneself. An error has been made or a difficult decision has been made. Sometimes we need to do that. Or for objectivity of tone. Guests are requested to vacate by, but active would work. Please vacate cabins by. Have a go, pause the slideshow and convert these passive statements to active statements. Really good to become conscious of when you do this. So myths from school regarding good writing and some freedom from false rules. One message we got at school was to use passive voice when expressing conclusions in an essay, and to never use I in assignments. You were kind of banished from your writing. So here is some freedom from false rules. First, of course, use active rather than passive. You may start any sentence you like with an and a but. You may start a sentence with because. You may end a sentence with a preposition. And you may split your infinitives. If you've forgotten what an infinitive means, it's a whole verb, for example, to run or to work. A split infinitive occurs when you insert an adverb between to and the verb itself. For example, to quickly run or to diligently walk. So we've been warned against split infinitives and they can sound clunky. But it's not actually a rule of grammar to avoid splitting them, and occasionally they work very well. Star Trek split the infinitive famously with the line, to boldly go, where no man or other or whatever it is. Okay, so a school was trying to teach us the virtue of objectivity, but it might not have been entirely clear. And, Charles Darwin used I in his conclusions when he wrote Evolution of the Species. So if he can do it, we can do it. Good writing guidelines, some from George Orwell, the author of 1984. Never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech you are used to seeing in print. Never use a long word where a short one will do. If it is possible to cut a word out, always cut it out. Never use the passive when you can use the active. Never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word, or a jargon word if you can think of an everyday English equivalent. Break any of these rules sooner than say anything outright barbarous. Or barbarous. Barbarous? Here's now a set of questions to ask yourself when writing for greater clarity in your work. And George Orwell's list and this set of questions are in your workbook. as a resource for you to take away. What am I trying to say here? What does that mean? Compared to what? What is the evidence for that assertion? How is that fact or argument relevant? How can I offer an example? Can I quantify that? What exactly does that word mean? Is it the right one? Will my readers understand it to mean what I intend it to mean? A little side step here. You might have heard of Scientology. Well, L. Ron Hubbard created a study of learning, how we learn, and he wrote about what he calls the 3 barriers to learning. And these are a lack of mass, too steep a gradient, and misunderstood words. So a lack of mass actually is exactly what we've been talking about of when ideas are too abstract. We need them to be concrete in order to understand them, to comprehend them. Right? So a lack of mass causes us to not understand what we're reading. When the writing has too steep a gradient, so we're increasing complexity of concepts too rapidly, is the second barrier to learning. The third one is misunderstood words. So when someone's reading and they come across a word they don't understand, everything after that word is not understood properly, right? It creates a block in the mind. And so teachers who work with this methodology take students back, looking until they find the word that was misunderstood, and they define that word, and after that the student is able to keep reading and comprehend what follows. It makes plenty of sense to me. I think I've had lots of experience with that. Sometimes the misunderstood word might not be one of the long ones. It could be a word like however, you know. So be clear. And the final couple of questions: how does this relate to my argument? And will this interest my reader? And how? One more set of questions that you can use is the reporter's 5 W's and H. So good journalists have been trained to write concretely and specifically and to answer these questions. Who, when, where, what, why, and of course how. So syntax, here's a little blast from the past from school. Syntax is the arrangement of words and phrases to create well-formed sentences in a language. And it's the branch of linguistics that deals with this. So our language syntax goes subject, verb, direct object. I see the dog, right? Subject acting on an object. Now it's interesting that actually in Japanese, the syntax structure is I, dog, seeing, and there's a mutuality in an interaction, whereas our English is very egocentric in a sense. In my creative writing course, I offer writing exercises where we play with the syntax and we break it up, and it's a wonderful way of channeling more original writing, not being so locked into one way of seeing things. So when we're writing, we want to make sure that our sentences are diverse. We have long sentences, short sentences, complex sentences, simple sentences. We want to avoid sentence fragments like running for the bus or a proud moment in my life. These are called sentence fragments because they're incomplete sentences. They need a subject and a verb. And running isn't a complete verb. It needs am or was. I am running or I was running. So beware of sentences that begin with those ing words. I met them in Richmond, walking their dog. Walking their dog is a sentence fragment. So if you join this onto another complete sentence, that gives it a subject and contains a full verb. So you'd have, I met them in Richmond, comma, well, actually, you wouldn't say walking their dog because that's going to become a misplaced modifier. So you might have to reapproach that whole sentence. I met them in Richmond when they were walking their dog, or something like that. Or another one example might be running for the bus, he tripped over, instead of just running for the bus. You want to also avoid run-on sentences like, I love writing reports, it makes me feel good, with the comma in between. Because actually, these are two complete sentences that have been stuck together with inappropriate punctuation. So, I love writing reports, it's a complete sentence. It makes me feel good is a complete sentence. So therefore, there should be a full stop after reports rather than a comma. So this is also known as comma splices or fused sentences. So if each part can stand on its own, it's a complete sentence and needs either a full stop or a semicolon rather than a comma, or you can insert a joining word like and or but or however or because. And it's also important to honour parallel construction. That blue is a bit hard to read, I might change that colour. Rather than running, walking and a swim, you'd write running, walking and swimming. There's more on that in your workbook. So commas mean a slight pause is required. That the purpose of them is also to separate items in a list. And so, for example, we invited the performers, the president and the chairman. And notice in that one that if we did not use commas after a comma after the president, because some of you have thought you can't do a comma before and, we would basically be saying that the president and the chairman are performers. We invited the performers, the president and the chairman, right, that they're the performers. So we need that comma after president to make the distinction that we're talking about three separate groups or individuals, right? The performers as the group, the president as the individual, and the chairman as the individual. Commas also set off a side thought in a sentence. For example, my friend Olga, who is a great cook, never forgets my birthday. So that's an aside, a clause, that little bit, who is a great cook, and needs commas on either side of it. And if the sentence would be confusing without it, you'd put it in. For example, the day before, comma, I borrowed my friend's shoes. If you say the day before I borrowed my friend's shoes, it sounds like an incomplete sentence. So then we say, well, what happened the day before you borrowed your friend's shoes? All right, so we need that. That's spelled out by putting the comma in there. So have a go. There's an exercise in your workbook of sentence fragments and run-on sentences. See how you go with that one. And pause the slideshow to do it. Paragraphs. The basic rule is a new paragraph is needed for every new idea or subject. And that might be an indentation to create a new paragraph or a line break. I'll come back to those in a minute. So more white space is easier on the eye. So if your paragraph is running to more than about 10 lines, you might consider breaking it. In the past, we used lots, much longer paragraphs than we do today. Perhaps it's just because we're in visual literacy overload at the moment and we just need to give our eyes a rest by having more white space, or because our span of attention is much shorter and we're not as patient as we were. Paragraphs can be ordered in the following ways. So you can order them chronologically, so in the sequence in which something happens in time, or in order of importance, or from general to specific, or from specific to general, or from simple to complex, or from pros to cons, or from question to answer, etc. So with the indentation and the line break, a book, you'll note, most books traditionally were used indentations for new paragraphs rather than a line break. Increasingly we're seeing line breaks, especially in self-published books. It's not considered as correct as an indentation, but it can be easier on the eye. So it's up to you what you do. The indentation is the more literary, conventional, traditional, etc. Subject-verb agreement. So they have to agree. So this is, for example, if you say, I love you. I is the subject, love is the verb. So I is singular, first person, and love is in the singular there. If we say he loves you, he is singular, third person, and loves changes form to match with he. And they love you again. We've got to change a form to bring in the plural. This is common sense to anyone who's been speaking English since they were born. For newcomers to our language, it can be confusing, I know. The program is good value, so we've got singular, singular. He offers good value. We've got singular, singular, and we've got matching verbs with their nouns. What are the solutions? And we've got plural, plural, it's all matching again. Be careful of words like team, which can be either singular or plural. So we could say the team is disappointed and staff is another one, and the staff are unhappy. But we can also put those words into the other. So for example, we could say the whole team is coming. We're speaking about the team as a whole, as a unit, so we can use singular there. Whereas if we say the team have mixed feelings about the outcome, we're speaking about the team as a set of individuals with different feelings. So therefore plural is more appropriate there. We could say the whole staff is united on this issue. Again, we're talking about as one whole, so we're singular. Or all staff are invited to drinks after work, and that's numerous staff, and so we'd use the are version, the plural. Pronoun reference and agreement. Pronouns replace the noun. For example, she for the girl. Okay, so pronouns also have to agree with their noun. When children eat vegetables, their parents are happy. When Sam eats vegetables, his parents are happy. A modern problem is the use of they to avoid gender-specific language. So, for example, when a student gets a good mark, they are pleased, is actually quite incorrect. This can be solved by using both singular pronouns. For example, when a student gets a good mark, she or he is pleased, but that sounds clunky. Or by making the noun plural also. For example, when students get good marks, they are pleased. So students and they. So anybody, anyone, each, either, everybody, everything, none, no one, someone, something are all singular. So beware of using they or their with these words. So rather than everyone must complete their test, it would be must complete his or her test, or you must complete your test. All tests must be completed. That's actually passive, which is not ideal either. Tricky stuff. In a sentence using neither and nor, the verb agrees with the final noun. You'll find an example of that in your workbook, and I suggest you jump over there right now for an exercise in agreement of subject and verb, pronoun and noun. An antecedent means the noun that the pronoun refers back to, so to speak. Anyway, have a go. It'll make sense. Pause the slideshow. Okay, so change of tense or person. Watch out for the trap of starting to write in one tense, for example, past tense, and then unwittingly switching to another, for example, present tense. So be consistent, and the same with person. So starting out in third person and then unwittingly switching to first person, etc., and switching back. So be consistent. You'll find examples of that in your book, of the persons and the tenses. The exception is when you're doing this on purpose for a particular effect or because time frames or perspective have changed. Dangling modifiers. Modifiers are words that qualify the noun. When they are missing or misplaced, they can give us a laugh. For example, the young girl was walking the dog in a short skirt. But they can also cause confusion. So, we know the dog is not wearing the skirt, she is. And that one's an obvious one. But there are plenty of times, and I've got a long list of examples in your workbook, where they can be confusing. And so it's important to put them in their proper place, which is as close to the word they modify as possible. If the subject is missing, put it in. You might have to make 2 sentences if it's very clunky. So rather than running for the bus, my book fell in the mud, because that is actually, technically what it means is that the book was running for the bus. All right? Running for the bus, I fell in the mud would be the way of explaining that. So a better way of putting it would be, I was running for the bus when my book fell in the mud. Have a go. You'll find a long list, do as many as you like, of the misplaced or dangling modifiers in your workbook. Stop the slideshow, have a go. And come back for apostrophes. So apostrophes have 2 main uses: to indicate a contraction, for example, I'm is short for I am, and to indicate ownership, for example, Bob's hat, Bob apostrophe S. Now, when the owner is plural, the apostrophe goes after the S, for example, the girls' hats. It's also used to show plural of lowercase letters. Lowercase letters, missing S. Such as when dotting I's and crossing T's. And it's used in expressions of time or value, for example, 2 weeks' notice, $2 worth of nuts. There's an exercise in your workbook on apostrophes that is really fantastic, worth doing, and there's a book called Apostrophe Catastrophe, which is rather gorgeous on this. It has a whole lot of photos throughout it that people have taken of signs and menus and things like that where apostrophes are in the wrong place. It's very funny. And there's also a book that I'm recommending. All these books are in the resources listed in your workbook, called Eats, Shoots and Leaves by Lynn Truss, which is very funny about apostrophes. She makes a passionate plea for people to respect and put the apostrophes in correctly, and it's just gorgeous. Colons and semicolons. Have you ever agonised over those? When do you use which? So use of the colon, which is the two dots, to introduce a list, to introduce an important or dramatic word, to introduce a quotation, to deliver an explanation, when the second sentence summarises, sharpens or explains the first, and for time, subtitles, numbers. Common colon errors between a verb and its object or complement. For example, the very best apples are, colon, those grown in. So you wouldn't put a colon after are. Right? Are being the verb and its object being those grown in, right? Between a preposition and its object, for example, my favourite cake is made of, colon, flour, eggs, sugar. So you wouldn't do that. So the of is the preposition and its object is the flour, eggs, sugar, etc. So you wouldn't insert that colon there. After phrases such as including and words like including, especially, and similar phrases. For example, there are many different types of people, including colon, domineering, social, cerebral, and helpful. So you don't need a colon after the word including, because such as, including, especially, etc., these words mean what the colon is doing, so you don't need to double up. Another thing just to be aware of quickly, do you capitalise the first letter after a colon? It's optional. Well, yes and no, in fact. So you can capitalise the first letter after a colon if what follows the colon is a complete sentence. If it's not a complete sentence, you wouldn't do it. But if it is a complete sentence, you can, it's optional. Whatever you do, just be consistent throughout your document. Colons and semicolons, let's get the semicolons, or the dot with the comma under it. To connect two complete sentences that are closely related, as a cure for a run-on sentence, so in the middle between the two instead of a comma. To separate a series that is complicated or whose items already contain internal punctuation, such as commas. For example, justice is relatively easy to bear, what stings is injustice. And I didn't go to the movies, instead I sat home with grandma. Okay, so have a go. You've got an exercise in your workbook on colons and semicolons. So pause the slideshow and see how you go with figuring out which goes where. And come back for punctuation with parentheses and quotation marks. In both cases, punctuation goes inside of the inverted commas or parentheses when there's a complete thought incited. Incited, that's interesting, inside them. Hey Bill, he shouted. So hey Bill is a complete thought, so the accompanying exclamation mark goes inside those quotation marks. He sat down on a chair with no seat and fell straight on the floor. So on a chair with no seat is a complete thought, so that's why it has its exclamation mark inside the brackets there. If the thought is completed outside the inverted commas or brackets, then punctuation should be outside them too. I bought some bread, the grainy kind, some olives and some cheese. So the grainy kind is just a little bit of an aside, it's not a complete thought in itself because it's lacking a verb, etc. So have a go. Punctuation with parentheses and quotation marks, a little exercise on that in your workbook. Troublesome words. There, and there. So there, hope you're not too stressed. Your versus your. It's and its. Who versus whom. Which, that, who. Whose versus whose. Me, myself, and I. Effect versus effect. Advice versus advise. Practice versus practice. License versus license, i.e. the different spellings, ICE and ISE. Fewer versus less. Among versus amongst, and while versus whilst. Program versus program with the double ME. Use versus utilise, and prepositions. If you head over to your workbook, you will find explanations of all of those words in there and when to use which one. So, contractions. Contractions are okay. We're allowed to contract in our writing. They are not too informal. So this is when you have two words collapsed into one. The effect is of more informality than when each word is fully spelled out. And the professions can think contractions don't sound professional, but they make for more user-friendly literature since they sound more natural, right? Even formal documents contain some contractions, e.g. can't, won't, isn't. Shakespeare used them, Jane Austen, Abraham Lincoln, legislation and contracts. They all use contractions. So, get over it. Abbreviations, on the other hand, are not okay. So write the word you want the reader to hear. Say what you mean. Take the time to spell it out or leave it out. Abbreviations like e.g., i.e., PA for per annum, K, KW, MPH, MGOK, etc., etc., don't belong in finished documents. So for e.g., write, for example, i.e., put a dash or write that is, PA, write each year or a year, K, write 1,000, etc. Avoid symbols, numerals, percent signs, the @ symbol, the hash symbol that aren't words. Just write words and punctuation signs. Percent, by the way, is 2 words, not 1. The exception is the $sign. The exception is when an acronym has become an organisation's full name, such as the ACU, the AGL, AMP, RACV, RSPCA, etc. And the exception is when you have to name something multiple times, in which case spell it out in full the first time and put the abbreviation in brackets after it and spell in full again in each new chapter. Conveying information in interesting ways. If you have a chunk of information to convey, do whatever you can to avoid presenting it as an indigestible lump. Break it up and weave it through the narrative. Have a character communicate it. Focus especially on producing good lyrical writing that contains many specific concrete words and a minimum of abstractions. Use Dale Carnegie's story point benefit model. Good fiction does this brilliantly, obviously. It doesn't tell directly but shows indirectly through character, action and dialogue. Editing, rewriting and proofing. Nearly to the end of this long session on language. So editing. We've talked about editing in the very first session, and we've talked about rewriting to mean deliberately applying the power writing techniques of showing through action, sentences and details. But it also, of course, means tweaking the writing to improve it grammatically, right? And proofing means checking for errors before sending it out, which is, as you know, essential. How many of us have sent something out and then looked at it again and thought, oh no. As you can see, I've had a few of those moments in this slideshow where I thought I'd read it multiple times and cleared it all up and still found errors. So you really need to do that. So proofing is looking for mistakes. It's like looking at the individual trees in a forest. And editing is looking for meaning. You're looking at the whole forest. You're checking for flow, sequence, impact. In the industry of editors, editing also, that they will talk about doing a line edit versus a structural edit. So the line edit is looking for those errors of language. But I'm just drawing that other distinction there. And then proofing is something that comes right at the end before the work goes to the printer or gets sent. Something I like to talk about is the clunkometer. I have what I call a clunkometer, which means that as I'm reading, I get a little clunk, that doesn't flow, that doesn't sound nice, it doesn't feel good, whatever, as I'm reading. Whenever I get the little clunk, I go back and tweak my language, tweak the expression of it. So the more that you do this, the more you write, the more you'll become aware of your own internal clunkometer that will let you know when your writing is not as fluent as it could be. Dr. DeMartini says that inspired writing just flows seamlessly and doesn't need rewriting. And I think that's true. I find that when I'm in the flow, in the zone, I do less rewriting than when I'm sort of tussling more with some of my content. So breaking the rules, there's an old principle for most things, I think, that when you've mastered the rules, you can break them. And accomplished writers break the rules to shock, to be mysterious, to purposely leave things unsaid, or for a myriad of other reasons. Breaking the rules might mean that one is not always observing all the disciplines of syntax, but the writing must still have style, voice, and rhythm. So you will find sentence fragments in the very best writing when it's done properly and it's done well. The myth of writing well easily. A writer is somebody for whom writing is more difficult than it is for other people, says Thomas Mann. So work hard to make your writing seem to have cost you no effort at all. The singer, unlike the talker, rehearses to get what she or he utters exactly right. As writers, we are aiming to get our message exactly right. Does your writing sing? Slow writing. You're familiar with slow cooking, right? Where there was a decision that there was too much instant food and fast food, and so there was a return to quality, slow cooking from scratch, wholesome meal preparation. Same thing's happening with writing, with all this bad language, it's texting, this emailing, these shortcuts, these, write a book in a weekend, all of that. There is a movement afoot for slow writing, to slow down, to enjoy it, to have it be an art, to have it be really good, wholesome. Speaking of good and wholesome, healing yourself is very possible through writing, as you know. Writing does heal. We know that we can use it therapeutically in journal writing and things like that. And I know for myself that when I write certain short stories, I find that the writing of them heals if I'm working on stuff that is personal for me as well. But there's another level at which we can heal ourselves through writing, and that is that there's a principle that one thing reflects everything. I did workshops in the 80s where they talked about this, how you played a game in the workshop was an indicator, a reflection of how you went through life. And so the same is true with our writing style. It might be, for example, that we use a lot of those run-on sentences. Well, I have got, I worked at one point with a woman who would send me emails that were just full of run-on sentences. One complete sentence after another with just commas between or ellipses, the little 3 dots, just one after another. And this woman was always feeling rushed and always feeling in a hurry. And I finally said to her, give yourself some space by literally paragraphing your messages. Give yourself, put full stops, stop, slow down. And you'll find that you'll feel better in your life as well, because there's a connection. There's this mind-body loop that what we do with our thinking affects what we do with our body. The other place is passive voice. So when we write in the passive, those people are often living like victims. They're unable to move, take action. They're locked into the idea that something has been done to them, and they're often quite cerebral and they're not feeling their feelings. So if you take language out of the passive voice into active, you are much more likely to start taking more responsibility and experience more power in your life. So we're at the end of that mammoth session on language, and the resources that I've listed here are in the back of your workbook. The Little Red Writing Book by Mark Trednick that I quoted a few times, The Elements of Style by William Strunk and E.B. White, Eats, Shoots and Leaves by Lynn Truss, Apostrophe Catastrophe by Patrick Notchtree, and websites like Kip Wheeler's that will be in your workbook, and apps like Grammarly.com where you can go and check on things. Before we leave, let's just have a quick look at the structure of this presentation. I modelled it on the format system that I taught you in the last webinar, which was first to ask why does good writing matter, then what it looks like, then how to do it, and then what if good writing can heal it. That was our why, what, how, what if structure. So we're finished. Love to know what you found most useful in this session. If you have been discovering that there's more to the art of language than just speaking, and you'd like some help with your own expression, I also do work one-on-one with people as a writing coach and editor. It is important, I feel, to not appear as an amateur, to write powerfully, to write impactfully, and to be current in your language rather than old-fashioned, to make your writing easy for the reader rather than an effort. So I hope you have found this session useful, and if you want more help, let me know. So as ever, email me what worked for you about this session, what didn't work, how could it be improved, and thank you. Coming up next session, an overview of the publishing industry and your options. Well, I hope you enjoyed that third session of Write Your Magnificent Book webinar series on language tips and traps. You will have received, or I would have made you aware of, the little workbook that you would have been working through with all the grammar exercises, etc., through that session. And at the end of it, I listed a number of resources or recommended reading. So I thought, while we're kind of face-to-face, that I would take a moment to bring you face-to-face with some of those books. So here's the old classic, The Elements of Style by William Strunk and E.B. White. Really just excellent basic grammar rules, information very simply and directly. This is a delightful read. Eats, Shoots and Leaves by Lynn Truss. Beautiful book. I've put little smiley faces throughout it because it just made me smile so many times, because she really is making a point around the importance of language and honouring it and having it work well, and I just love it. This one, Apostrophe Catastrophe by Patrick Notchtree, is full of pictures where people have gone around taking photos of poor grammar and, hang on, I've got to try and get this right, poor grammar and punctuation and stuff in the community. And he goes through a whole lot of grammar rules and punctuation rules and stuff as well. That's really entertaining read. And this one I discovered recently, The Little Red Writing Book by Mark Tredennick, and I've been absolutely loving this book. He's a poet and an essayist, and he just really wants to honour language, the beauty of language, the art of language. Thoroughly enjoyed writing this. You will have noticed because I quoted him a million times, I think, throughout that session. So have a great week, or however long it is, until you hook into session number 4, which will be all about publishing your options, self-publishing, finding a traditional publisher, etc. We'll look at all those options. See you then.